G'day ladies and gents, Cubic Media here, inside the heart of a massive copper block factory. We are of course talking about a fully autonomous machine where you input blocks of copper and get out all the various weathered kinds of copper. But this video would be rather boring if I just went directly into the finished product. So let's get into some technical problem solving. The basic principle is that any copper block placed in the world near the player will randomly oxidize over time, producing these weathered states. They will finally terminate on this final state where the copper produces this nice amber green color. And this presents some interesting challenges, especially compared to other block conversion mechanics such as concrete powder to concrete and stripped logs, where you can harvest the block immediately after conversion. The issue of copper is that it doesn't convert immediately when you place it down, and it takes a while to go through multiple stages of corrosion before it gets to the final state. Furthermore, our design will need to consider that a player might want to actually obtain these intermediate states as well. So what this will involve is making a machine where we can place down copper blocks into a block storage, wait the optimal amount of time for them to oxidize to the next stage, and then harvest the blocks at the stage that we want. So to begin our journey, we need to look into how these weathered states vary over time. This visually immaculate matrix of copper blocks will form our empirical testing platform. We have every single copper block exactly 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks apart, and this is simply because copper blocks separated by 4 blocks will oxidize much faster than any other configuration. In the very center of our test bed, we have this position where the player stands in order to be in random tick range of all of this copper. We also have command blocks to run various functions to help us with the test. I start by pasting in a schematic to refresh all of our copper blocks. And we currently have random tick speed set to 0. What I do is activate this command block, then I'll activate this sequence, which will tick walk the game for a certain period of time. So that there was exactly 2 minutes of time for these copper blocks to oxidize. If I bring up the selection and analyze the area, we can then get the exact quantities of each copper variant. Repeating this process over multiple time steps obtains our empirical data for our distribution of the copper block variants over time. However, this is not quite what we want, because what you will notice is that you can see we have these sort of piecewise line segments forming what should be a continuous curve. What we can do to make these curves continuous is try to approximate them with known functions which seem to match the behavior that we are seeing. So here I've got a polynomial exponential curve with some fitting parameters that I can apply to fit it to our empirical data. By working out all of our functions and fitting parameters, we can obtain these continuous smooth curves which very closely resemble our empirical data. What we obtain is a perfect description of the distribution of copper block variants over time. And what you can clearly see is we obviously begin with 100% pure copper. However, over time, the total amount of copper decreases exponentially. At the same time, the amount of exposed copper will increase logarithmically. Then the next stage will begin to increase slightly slower because we need to obtain the exposed state before we can get the weathered state. And so what we see is this interplay going from pure to exposed to weathered, then finally to the oxidized state, which is the final state where eventually all the copper block variants will converge towards. Alright, that's enough theory for now. Later on, those graphs will be extremely useful for working out the optimal harvest time for our machine. But first, we need to actually figure out a way to get all of our copper blocks into this spread out formation. A sophisticated cube maker like the one I have right here gets an extremely volume dense configuration of copper blocks. However, this is extremely inefficient for obtaining our oxidized copper, because as you can see, the oxidation sort of spreads from block to block. And this is because each copper block will check its surrounding oxidized coppers and only oxidize if the surrounding ones are in a higher oxidized state. So what this means is we get this even distribution of oxidization, which slows down the oxidization significantly overall. Now that's a mouthful of copper oxide. So what we need to do is have a block stream that for every copper block, we substitute 4 other block types. If only there was a block that can be placed down and removed automatically without intervention of the player. And amazingly, 1.17 has provided such a solution in the form of powdered snow. Powdered snow is extremely unique because it can be placed down fully autonomously, moved by pistons, then picked up again, all without needing the player. This is absolutely perfect for our copper factory. This is an extremely compact module which is designed to fit within the constraint of our 4 block distance between copper block streams. What it does is it takes a copper block from an input stream and spreads it out evenly with the 4 blocks in between in order to get our optimal oxidization. And this here was an interesting challenge, where we combined both block streams and storage tech in order to make use of our powdered snow. First of all, we need a method to reliably detect when there is a powdered snow moving in a block stream in order to pick it up with a bucket and not end up wasting the buckets. It turns out this is definitely possible. What we do is, we detect whenever this block stream is moving. However, powdered snow does not connect to walls. This is a really simple circuit to obtain what we need. What we do is, if the block stream is moving, this observer will be powered. If the block that's about to be pushed in front of the dispenser is a copper block, it will be connected to this wall and therefore send a pulse to this rail. In any block stream, the first block to move is the one at the very end. So this observer is the very first one to power, which will power this rail, meaning that when this observer gets power from the block stream moving, the rail has already been powered and therefore this dropper does not receive the block update needed to be powered. If the block that is about to be pushed in front of the dispenser is not a copper block, it does not connect to the wall, and therefore this observer powers and also powers the rail, sending the update to the dropper, sending the pulse to our dispenser, telling it to pick up the snow in a bucket. The result is that we get perfect separation of our powdered snow back into shulker boxes and a block stream of pure copper blocks. What I did next was tile all the modules together into a 4x4 grid, making a 16 column silo. We can then devise a centralized distribution point for all of our copper blocks, which is split 4 separate ways into our 4 separate silos. And our silos store all of the copper blocks separated with their 4 block distance for optimal oxidization. We then add on conveyor extensions that extend all the way to our system at the bottom, which separates out our snow blocks, leaving us with pure copper blocks being combined back together into a centralized blast chamber. And this is of course the TNT efficient blast chamber that I designed already. Check out the video if you want to know more. What really amuses me about this factory is how we combine blockstream technology with storage tech just to make something as simple as a copper block oxidizer. At the very top, we manage all the powder snow buckets in shulker boxes. This is because they are unstackables, and this makes it very difficult to handle them. These shulker boxes are then emptied by an automatic shulker box unloader, which fills up our blockstream system. So we have different elements which need to be distributed around the machine in various forms, much like oil throughout a machine or blood throughout arteries. The cycle begins as we unload the shulker boxes and empty out the buckets into our block streams. The empty buckets go down through these hopper lines, and the empty boxes are also collected and sent to the bottom. The buckets and shulker boxes are then redistributed throughout all of these systems, such as these shulker box loaders, which fill up again with powder snow buckets as we empty out the block streams. And we also have these dispensers which take in the empty buckets. When we fill up a shulker box with powder snow, the full box is then collected and stored here. We then have this bubble elevator which goes all the way back up to the top, connected up to this chest. When this chest is empty, a signal is sent all the way down to the bottom telling the system to dispatch more shulker boxes of powder snow. And finally, we redistribute all of these powder snow boxes throughout all of the shulker box unloaders. So all of that just to obtain a closed loop cycle of powder snow separating our copper blocks. And all of this complexity actually pays off, because the faster rate of oxidization by separating the copper blocks far outweighs the increased capacity of having copper blocks in between. So now we have a machine that is capable of storing up our copper blocks in the optimal configuration and then automatically recycle them in a closed loop. Our final step will be to figure out the optimal way to use the machine in order to get the most copper blocks oxidized. In order to do this, I have organized a special interface for this factory. There are two modes of operation. We have the on-off switch right here. And right now, we are operating in slow mode. Slow mode is for when you want to use the farm continuously while AFK. This means the player is present and continuously placing down blocks which are being sent to our storage silos. This introduces a very interesting degree of freedom with the machine, because the rate at which you send blocks into the machine dictates the kind of blocks that you'll get out of it. If we go back to our copper block distributions and instead divide the percentage of blocks by the amount of time that has passed, you'll obtain these curves whose peaks depict the optimal time interval to harvest each copper variant. For pure copper, the interval is obviously 0 because all of our pure copper exists at the very start of the operation. Exposed copper also has an interval of effectively 0 because the moment you start placing down pure copper, you can also start obtaining exposed copper. For our final two stages, however, we obtain an optimal time interval of about 22 minutes for weathered copper and 72 minutes for oxidized copper. Solving our functions analytically, and we pretty much get no time interval for obtaining the first two copper blocks variants. Our analytical solution for our final ones comes to about 22.5 minutes for the weathered copper and 74.8 minutes for our fully oxidized copper. The thing that is rather counterintuitive about these two results is that this is effectively the amount of time that you should wait after placing down the initial blocks of copper before you go and harvest to obtain each block copper variant. So if you want a majority of weathered copper, then you should wait 22.5 minutes before harvesting. If you want the fully oxidized variant, then you should wait 74.8 minutes to obtain the most. And the way to interpret this result is that if you want the exposed variant, you need to wait anywhere between initially placing down the copper blocks and harvesting the weathered copper in order to obtain the exposed copper. So how do these results translate to our factory? Well, consider that what our factory is actually doing is for any given input stream of blocks, it is slowing down the amount of time it takes for all these blocks to get to the bottom. So what this means is that if you increase the capacity of your silos, you can increase the speed at which you can convert copper. If I analyze the capacity of the silos with a selection area like so, what you can see is that we have exactly 2,176 spaces with all of our combined silos. The capacity of your copper factory is effectively the distance that your copper blocks need to travel before they get harvested. And depending on the speed at which you input blocks, this will vary the velocity of your blocks. So what we need to work out is, given a distance for our blocks to travel, and the optimal amount of time that you need to wait for a block to get to the bottom, we obtain the velocity of our block stream needed to match the variant that we want to target. Let's say we want to obtain the final state of oxidized copper at 74.8 minutes. All we need to do is type out our equation. So we have a silo capacity of 2176 blocks divided by 74.8 minutes is approximately equal to 29.1 blocks per minute. If we take 29.1 blocks per minute multiplied by 60 minutes per hour, we obtain 1746 blocks per hour. And this needs to be the speed of our block stream. If we take a look inside of this lectern, we can actually vary the rate of the farm. So what we want is something close as possible to what we calculated, which is somewhere in between these two values. 1500 per hour will probably be good enough. So if we go ahead and run this machine in continuous operation, by time our fresh copper blocks reach the bottom, this should mostly be the fully oxidized state. And to clarify, this does not guarantee that all the blocks will be oxidized when they reach the bottom. In fact, many of the blocks may not be oxidized yet, because you can always slow down the machine and let it take longer to guarantee more blocks get oxidized, but that additional time you spend waiting decreases the rates overall. And by looking at all these oxidized copper blocks already in the silos, you might be able to guess what the second mode of operation is. If you don't want to be AFKing the system continuously placing down copper blocks, what you can do instead is activate the fast mode. This will allow you to place down the copper blocks at the fastest rate that the machine can handle, allowing you to replenish the system as quickly as possible and replace all of the oxidized copper blocks stored in the silos with fresh copper ones. So if you just want to intermittently load it up with blocks and collect them every now and then, all you need to do, chuck a stack into this dropper, put the rest into this double chest, put maybe half in your hand like so, switch it on, and hold down right click. And as you can see, we are slowly replenishing the system with fresh copper blocks as all the oxidized ones get pushed down to the bottom and collected by our blast chamber. Once you finish placing down all the copper blocks, all that will happen is that you'll run out of items to place down and the system will wait idle. Just switch it off. You can see we've already obtained a shulker box of oxidized copper. And if I go ahead and activate random tick speed again, our silos will begin to fill up with our oxidized copper, and after a while we can harvest again. So just to clarify, this machine has two modes. You have the fast mode, where you place down blocks as quickly as possible, and this will only obtain the exposed variant if you do it continuously. However, you also have the option to switch the farm into slow mode, where you can chuck in entire shulker boxes full of copper blocks into this shulker box unloader, and then you can finally adjust the rate of the farm to whatever suits you in order to primarily obtain the type of copper block that you want. So right here we have a simple system which will collect some of these copper block variants, and if this system overflows around the back, we'll actually start dispensing these types to the player for them to place down and recycle back into the machine to eventually make them into the oxidized copper. So my assumption with this machine is that people will primarily use this to get the final oxidization stage. And I thought it would be nice to just have a simple buffer of the other copper block variants which you can grab whenever you want them. You might also notice that none of these copper blocks are actually waxed. And my philosophy behind this is that instead of wasting copious amounts of honeycomb on waxing the final oxidized copper state, which doesn't even need waxing, I'd suggest making a separate blast chamber to wax the different copper block variants separately. So there we have it. Fully autonomous copper block conversion. If you wanted to play around with this design, I'll be leaving a world download as well as a schematic down in the description. As for Wavetech's Ultimate Shulker Farm project, they've gathered all the materials and we're getting ready to build. However, there are still some minor issues to be figured out with the design. So hopefully we'll be able to build the shulker farm soon, and I will see you next time.